There are winters a country lives through, and there are winters a country makes up its mind in. The winter that came down on Belleau Moor that year was the second sort. It began in the last week of October, with a rain that did not stop, and it took the barley down flat in the fields before a single sickle was lifted. Then the rain turned to sleet, and the sleet to a long white silence, and by the middle of November, there was not a farm on the moor that had brought in half of what it sowed. The price of a loaf in the market at Wexcombe doubled and doubled again. The carriers stopped coming over the high road. The town drew in on itself the way a hand draws in on a coin, and every door in it learned the same lesson at the same hour, which was that a man who opens his hand in a hungry year opens his grave. That was the rule of the place, and nobody had to say it aloud. It was said in 100 small ways. Instead, it was said in the way the baker set his shutters at 4 in the afternoon and would not answer knocking. It was said in the way a woman crossed the lane, rather than pass a stranger close enough to be spoken to. It was said in the way the parish put a lock on the poorhouse door, and the parish did not once think of itself as cruel, because cruelty is a word for what other people do, and what we do is called sense. A hard year does not make a town wicked. It makes a town careful, which is worse, because carefulness can be defended. So the doors shut, and the town congratulated itself on its good sense. And in all of Wexcombe there was one house on the moor road that kept a lamp burning in its window through the whole of that black winter, and everybody in the town knew whose house it was, and everybody in the town thought her a fool for it. Her name was Thomasin Harrow. She was 24 years old. She had a house she could not keep, a debt she could not pay, and a name that made men look at the floor when she came into a room. On the 11th of January, she went into Wexcombe to ask for time, and she was refused. She asked properly. She had dressed for it in the good gray wool that had been her mother's, and she had walked the 4 miles in from the moor road, so as not to spend a shilling on a cart. And she stood in the front office of Mr. Brow, Ottery, attorney-at-law, with her hands quiet in front of her, and her back straight, and her boots leaking, and she asked for 6 months. Mr. Ottery was not an unkind man. That was the thing she would think about afterward, walking home. He was not cruel, and he did not enjoy it, and he gave her a chair and he heard her out to the end without once looking at his watch, and then he folded his hands on the desk and told her no in a voice of real regret. The mortgage on the Harrow house fell due at Lady Day. It had been 3 years falling due. There would be no 4th extension, because the man who held the paper had died in the autumn, and the paper had gone to his heirs. And the heirs were not sentimental about Belleau Moor, and had never met her father. Then he said the thing that mattered, and he said it gently, which somehow made it land harder. I will tell you plainly, Miss Harrow, because nobody else will. There is not a man in 3 counties who will lend a farthing on that house, and it is not because of the house. It is because of the name. You will not raise the money here. You will not raise it anywhere within 100 miles. If you have a friend in the world, this is the season to go to them, and if you have not, then I would advise you to make your terms with Lady Day and be gone before it comes to a sale, for a sale is a public thing, and it will be worse. Good afternoon. The door of the front office closed behind her. It was 3 in the afternoon, and already the light was going. They did not hate her because her father was a thief. It would have been easier if her father had been a thief. Gideon Harrow had been the miller at Wexcombe for 26 years, and in all that time, no man had ever accused him of taking a grain that was not his. He had weighed honest, and he had ground clean, and he had kept his accounts in a fair round hand that any fool could read, and when he died there had not been 1 penny in the world that he had come by wrongly. There had not been 1 penny in the world at all. That was his crime, and the town had never forgiven it. In the bad year, the year the fever came down the valley and the sheep died, and half the parish could not pay, Gideon Harrow had opened his books at the mill, and he had gone down the columns with his pen, and he had struck out the debts, not deferred them, struck them out. He struck out Corrigan the smith, who owed him £9. He struck out the Ludlow family, who owed him 11. He struck out the widow at Kite's Bottom for the whole of 2 years of flour, and when she came to the mill to thank him, he would not hear it, and he sent her home with a sack she had not asked for and could not carry, and he carried it for her himself the whole of the 3 miles. He fed the parish out of his own loft for a season and a half. When his own credit ran thin, he borrowed against the mill to go on feeding it. When the mill was mortgaged to the roof, he borrowed against the house. And the parish ate, and the parish lived, and the fever went away, and the parish looked up at last and saw the miller standing there with nothing, and it could not bear him. That was the thing Thomason had learned at 22, and had never once been able to unlearn. There is no hatred in the world like the hatred of a man for the person who has fed him. Gratitude is a weight. It sits on a man at his own table and eats with him. It is in his mouth every time he passes the mill and sees the wheel standing still. And a whole town cannot go about for 20 years carrying a weight like that, and so a town does the only thing that will lift it, which is to decide that the man was a fool. They said it kindly at first. Soft old Harrow, good heart and no head. Then they said it less kindly, because the mill went, and the men who had worked in it went with it, and there was a way of telling the story in which that was his doing and not theirs. And, at the end, they said it with a kind of comfortable contempt, which is the way people speak of a debt they have arranged never to pay. And by then Gideon Harrow was dead of a lung fever he had got carrying coals to a house that was not his, and there was nobody left to say otherwise. He left his daughter 3 things. He left her the house on the Moor Road with a mortgage on it that would eat it in 3 years. He left her a name that meant folly from Wexcombe to the sea, and he left her the lamp. It was an ordinary lamp, brass and glass, nothing in it worth a shilling. He had kept it burning in the front window every night of his life, winter and summer, set where the light would carry furthest out across the moor. He never made a speech about it. He said only when she was a child and asked him that Bellow Moor was a bad piece of country to be lost on in the dark, and that a light in a window cost a farthing of oil and a man's life cost rather more, and that he had no intention of lying warm in his bed doing sums about the difference. She had kept it burning after he died, every night, through the whole of that starving winter, when oil was dear and she was eating 1 meal a day and pretending to herself that she was not. The town knew she did it. The town found it very amusing. Let her burn it, they said. It is the last thing the Harrows have got to burn. She came home in the dark with the attorney's words going round in her like a stone in a bucket, and she was so taken up with them that she did not see the man until she was almost on top of him. He was lying against the wall at the turn of her own gate, in the lee of it, out of the wind. He had got himself into the angle of the stone the way an animal does, and he was not moving, and her first thought, God forgive her, was that he was dead, and her second thought was that she could not afford a burying. Then he moved. He got his head up, and he looked at her. She had seen beggars. There had been a great many that winter on the Moor Road. Men walked out of the manufacturing towns with the work gone, walking to somewhere else where they had heard there was work, and finding there was not. This one had been walking a long time. He was a big man, gone gaunt, in a coat that had been a good coat once, and had stopped being one, and his boots were the boots of a man who was worn out better, and taken what he could get. There was a fortnight of black beard on him, and the skin under it was the color of tallow. He had a hand wrapped in a rag. He said nothing at all. He only looked at her, and there was no begging in the look. That was the strange thing, and she thought about it afterward for a long time. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather. He had stopped expecting. Thomason Harrow stood in the road with 4 miles of walking in her legs, and Lady Day coming at her like a train of horses, and she did the sum in her head that she had been doing every night for a year. There was a heel of bread in the crock. There was the last of the bacon, which was to be Sunday's, and it was Thursday. There was oil enough in the can for perhaps 9 nights. She had eaten nothing since a bit of oat bannock at 6 that morning. She said, "Can you stand?" He got himself up off the wall. It took him some doing, and he did it without a sound, and when he was up he was a head taller than her, and she was too tired to be frightened, which she would think about afterward as well. She said, "The kitchen is warm, come in out of it." She sat him at the table, and she raked the fire up, and she put the bread and the whole of the bacon in front of him, and she poured him the milk that was meant for her breakfast, and she sat down across from him with her hands folded so that he would not have to eat under a stranger's eye. He ate the way starving men eat, which is not greedily but with a terrible carefulness as though the food might be taken back. When he was half through, he stopped. He looked at the empty board in front of her. He said, "You are not eating." His voice was low and worn, and it was not the voice she had expected out of that beard. She noticed it. She did not think about it. She said, "I ate before I went out. I am not hungry. Go on." That was the first lie she had told in a 12-month, and she told it easily. And she watched him decide whether to believe her, and she watched him decide to let her have it. And he went on, eating. He did not eat the whole of it. He left half of it on the board, and pushed the plate an inch toward her, and did not look up when he did it. When he was done, she gave him the blanket off her own bed, and she took him out and showed him the stable, which was warm because the cow was in it, and she said he might lie in the straw and welcome. And she went to the door and stopped. She said, "There is a lamp in the front window. It burns all night. If you wake in the dark and are frightened of where you are, look for it, and you will know." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because my father would have." And she went out, and she barred nothing. She had 1 coin in the house, a 6pence in a cup on the mantel. In the morning she meant to send him off with it, and she lay awake a long while, working out how she would do without it, and she could not, and she decided to do without it anyway. She was asleep before 10. At 2:15, a horse came up the moor road walking, and stopped short of the gate. The man in the stable was awake. He had been awake the whole while. He came out into the yard without a sound, moving quite differently now than he had moved in the road, and he stood in the black shadow of the wall and watched the rider dismount. The rider was a small, neat person in a plain coat, and he came forward and looked at the state of him and could not keep it out of his face. Ruddock said, in a voice pitched for one hearer only, "A fortnight, Your Grace." A fortnight on the road and the last 3 nights of it in the open, and your hand cut, and Lord Crawle's people expect you at Marchbury within the month. The settlement is signed. The lady is waiting. There will be talk if you are not there. Alaric, 9th Duke of Kelmarsh, stood in the yard of a mortgaged house on Bellow Moor with a stranger's blanket over his arm, and the taste of her Sunday bacon in his mouth, and he looked past his man at the front window of the house, where a lamp was burning steadily out into 4 miles of empty dark, for no reason on this earth except that somebody might be out in it. He said, "Send word to Marchbury that I am delayed." Ruddock said, "Delayed how long, Your Grace?" And the Duke of Kelmarsh, who had told his man that he was come to Wexcombe to look over the properties that would fall to him with a wife, and who had not looked at a single one of them, and did not intend to, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not know yet. Go." He was still there. In the morning, she had thought he would be gone. She came out at first light, with the 6pence closed in her fist, meaning to be quick about it and not to look at him while she did it. And she found the cow milked and the stall raked out, and the man himself at the wood pile with his coat off, splitting her winter logs left-handed because the right one was ruined. She stood in the cold and watched him for a moment before he knew she was there. He was doing it badly. Any man would have. But he was doing it, and he had been doing it a while, and there was a stack there that had not been there the night before. She said, "Your hand is cut." He set the axe down. He said, "It is nothing." She said, "It is not nothing. It is a fortnight old, and it has gone bad, and if you do not let me see it, you will be dead of it, inside the month, and I have not the money to bury you. Sit down." She said it before she had decided to say it, and she heard herself say it, and she thought, I have 4 miles of walking in me, and Lady Day at my throat, and I am about to spend an hour of daylight and a pint of my father's brandy on a man I do not know. He sat down. She fetched the brandy. It was the last of it. There had been a bottle and a half in the house when her father died, and she had used it for exactly this, over 2 years, for a scalded arm at the Corrigans, and a bad berth at Kite's Bottom, and a boy at the smithy who put a nail through his foot. And now there was a third of a bottle, and after this morning there would be none. She did not tell him that. She unwrapped the rag, and she looked at the hand, and she did not let anything come into her face, though it was ugly, and going the wrong color up the wrist. She said, This will be bad. You may swear if you want to. I have heard it. She poured the brandy into it. He did not swear. He did not make a sound. He went white to the lips, and he held the hand still on the table, and he shut his eyes, and she worked at it, and got the muck out of it, and cut a clean strip off the good gray wool that had been her mother's, because there was nothing else clean in the house, and bound it. He opened his eyes and looked at the gray wool going round his hand. He said, That was a good gown. She said, It was us. He said, Why? It was the second time he had asked her why, and she was beginning to notice that he asked it like a man who genuinely did not know the answer and had been asking a long time. She said, Because you cannot split wood with a rotten hand, and you have been splitting mine. He said, That is not the reason. She sat back and looked at him. She was tired, and she had not eaten, and Mr. Ferd, Ottery's voice was still going round in her, and she found she had not the strength to be careful. She said, No, it is not. The reason is that my father would not have let a man sit in his kitchen with a hand like that, and I have very little of my father left, and I am not going to spend it being sensible there. Now you have it, and you may think me a fool, which is what everybody within 9 miles thinks, and they are probably right. She got up and put the empty bottle on the shelf, upside down the way you do when a thing is finished. Oh, she said, there is porridge. You will eat it standing, because I have not the time to sit, and neither I think have you. Then she said, and she was not looking at him when she said it, You may stop here a day or 2 if you have nowhere. Until the hand mends. It is no charity. There is work in the yard, and I cannot do it, and I cannot pay a man to. There was a silence behind her. She said without turning round, I am not asking your name, and I am not asking where you have come from, so you need not trouble to invent either. You have a hand that will not hold a fork, and a face like a dead fire, and you were lying in my gateway at nightfall in January. That is the whole of what I know about you, and it is the whole of what I want to know. He said, very quietly, Most people would want to know rather more. She said, Most people are the ones who put the lock on the poorhouse door. She went out to the yard with the 6pence still shut in her hand, unspent, and she found she was shaking, and she did not know why, and she stood by the wall until it stopped. Behind her in the kitchen, a man with a Duke's rent roll and 4,000 acres of Kelmarsh at his back sat looking at a strip of a dead woman's gown wound round his hand by somebody who had just given away her last brandy, her last bacon, and an hour of daylight she could not spare, to a stranger she had decided, on no evidence whatever, was worth it. He had told himself he was here to look at a house. He was beginning to understand, with a coldness at the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the weather, that he had not once looked at the house, and that he was not going to, and that the failure in the arrangement was not going to be hers. She got her first proper look at him on the 3rd day, and it frightened her. The fever had come out of the hand and gone through him in the night, and by morning he was in the straw with his teeth, going and no sense in him, and she got him into the house because she could not have got him into a grave. It took her the better part of an hour to move him 12 feet. She did it in stages, and she talked to him the whole while, and afterwards she could not have said one word of what she had said. She put him in her father's bed, because it was the only bed with a fire in the room, and she sat with him. Somewhere past midnight the fever broke, and he slept, and she was too tired to move, and she sat in the chair with the candle guttering, and she looked at him properly for the first time. She had washed the worst of the road off him herself, 3 nights running. The black beard was still there. But the hair was pushed back off the forehead, where she had wrung the cloth over it, and under all of it, for the first time, there was a face. It was not a beggar's face. It was a hard face and a young one, younger than she had thought, and she could not have put a year to him. The bones in it were good. They were the bones of somebody who had been made by people who could afford to make faces. And the hands on the coverlet were split and blistered and filthy, and the nails were broken to the quick, and under all of that they were long and they were straight, and there was not a callus on either palm that was older than a month. She sat looking at those hands for a long time. A man who has swung an axe since he was 10 does not have hands like that. A man walked out of a manufacturing town does not have hands like that. Those hands had held a pen and a rein and nothing else in the whole of a life, and they had been wrecked in a fortnight, and there was only one way that happened, which was that a man who had never done it before had gone out and done it on purpose. She thought, he is not what he says he is. Then she thought, he has never said what he is. He has never once told me a single thing. I have been the one talking. And she sat in her father's chair at 2 in the morning, 4 miles from the nearest soul who would come if she called, with a strange man in her father's bed, and his hand wrapped in her mother's gown. And she understood with a perfect and quiet clarity that she had let something into her house that she did not have the first idea about. She looked at the door. She could bar it from the outside. She could walk to Corrigan's in 90 minutes and be back with 3 men before it was light. She looked at the fire. It wanted feeding. She thought about a man lying in the angle of a wall in the rain who had looked at her without begging, because he had stopped expecting. Then Thomas and Harrow got up and put 2 more logs on her fire, and wrung out the cloth, and sat down again, and did not go anywhere at all. We will pause here for just a moment. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. She had lived 2 years now in a country where nothing was ever given. That was not bitterness. It was arithmetic. Corrigan, the smith, who owed her father £9 struck out of a book, would not shoe her horse without the money in his hand, and she did not blame him, because the money had to come from somewhere, and it did not come from anywhere. The Ludlows, whose £11 had been struck out in the same afternoon, sent word at Michaelmas that they could not take her hay after all. The widow at Kite's Bottom crossed the lane. That one had cost her something. That one had cost her a whole evening. She did not tell anybody about. She had learned the way of it. Kindness given is a debt owed, and people do not pay debts, they escape them. And the surest way to escape a debt is to decide the creditor never deserved it. Her father had fed a parish, and the parish had made him a fool for it, and it had done that not because it was wicked, but because it could not carry him any other way. So she knew, sitting up with a fevered stranger through the small hours, exactly what she had bought herself. She had bought herself a man who would be ashamed of her when he was well. She had seen it happen 4 times. They came in hungry and they went out owing, and after a while they stopped touching their hats on the road, and after a while longer they told a story in the tavern in which she had been proud about it, and that was the end. She thought, when he can stand, he will want something. That is the shape of it. They always want a thing at the end, a loan, a letter, a bed for another week, and they ask for it hating you, and when you give it, they hate you worse. Let him ask, she thought. Let him ask and be done and go, and I will have the house to myself, and one less mouth, and I will have the whole of Lady Day to think about instead. She waited for it. He mended slowly. He did the yard work she had not been able to do. He mucked out and he split, and he mended the gate that had swung on one hinge since the summer, and he did it badly, and then less badly, and he did not once complain of the hand. He did not ask her for a loan. He did not ask her for a letter, or a week, or a shilling, or a character, or anything at all. He did not tell her a hard-luck story. He did not once explain himself, and he did not once mention leaving. And Thomasin Harrow found herself in the last week of January, standing at her own window watching a strange man mend her wall with one hand, and discovering that she had no idea whatever what to do with a person who did not want anything from her. She had defenses against being used. She had built them carefully, and she had needed every one of them. She had nothing at all against this, and it frightened her more than a demand would have, because a demand she could have refused. There is a particular kind of looking that a man does when he has decided a thing in advance, and is only gathering the proof of it. Alaric of Kelmarsh had come up onto Bellow Moor believing he already knew what people were, and by the first week of February he had stopped believing it, and he did not notice that he had stopped, and that was how it got him. He had meant to stay 3 days. He was still there when the snow went. He told himself at first that it was the hand. Then he told himself that it was the weather. Then he stopped telling himself anything, and simply got up in the dark each morning and went out, and did the work of a man he was not, and watched. What he saw was this. On the second Tuesday, a boy came up the moor road at 9 at night, running, and hammered on the door. It was Jem Corrigan, the smith's youngest, 12 years old, and his mother was 3 days in labor and going wrong, and the doctor at Wexcombe would not come out to the smithy because Corrigan owed him. Alaric watched Thomasin Harrow stand in her own doorway and take that in. He knew what Corrigan was to her. She had told him one evening, flatly, without heat, in the course of explaining why she did not go into Wexcombe on market day if she could help it. Corrigan the smith had owed her father £9 and had it struck out of a book, and Corrigan the smith had stood up in the tavern at the sale of the mill and said loud, so that it carried, that soft old Harrow had ground his own daughter into the ground, and that a man who could not keep his books had no business keeping a mill. She got her cloak. She was gone the whole of that night, and the whole of the next day. She came back at dusk on the Wednesday, grey to the mouth, and she stood in the yard, and would not come in for a moment, and he understood without being told that the woman had lived, and the child had not. She said, when she did come in, only, "Put the kettle on," and then she sat by the fire in her wet cloak, and looked at nothing for about 1/4 of an hour, and then she got up, and went out, and milked the cow. Corrigan did not come. Corrigan did not send. Corrigan, Alaric learned later, told it in the tavern that the Harrow girl had pushed her way in where she was not wanted, and had likely done more harm than good, and that was the last that was ever said of it in Wexcombe. She never mentioned it again. That was the first thing. The second thing was the ring. Oil was dear that winter. It got dearer. By the second week of February, the can in the scullery had a finger of oil in the bottom of it, and Alaric, who had been counting because he had begun to count everything in that house, knew there were 4 nights in it, 5 if she was careful. On the Friday she walked into Wexcombe and came back with a full can, and she said nothing about it, and he did not ask, and he did not need to, because he had seen her hands and she was not wearing her mother's ring. He said nothing about that either. He went out to the woodpile and split logs for 2 hours, with a hand that was still not right, and did not stop when it opened again. And Ruddock, who came up the moor road that night with a letter from Marchbury, found His Grace the Duke of Kelmarsh sitting on a chopping block in the dark in a dead miller's coat, bleeding through a bandage cut out of a dead woman's gown, looking at a lamp in a window. Ruddock said, "Your Grace, I must have an answer for Lord Crawl." Alaric said, "She sold her mother's ring today." Ruddock said, "Your Grace," quote. Alaric said she sold her mother's ring to buy oil for a lamp that burns all night in an empty window on an empty road for the benefit of nobody at all. There is not a house within 4 miles. Nobody comes this way. Nobody has ever come this way. She is starving, Ruddock. She is eating 1 meal a day, and she thinks I do not know it, and she sold her mother's ring, and she bought oil. Ruddock was quiet. Then he said carefully, "And what does that tell, your grace?" And Alaric said, "It tells me that I have spent 39 years among people who would not cross a room for a stranger, and I had begun to think that was the whole of what people were. And I was wrong, and I do not know yet what I am going to do about being wrong." The third thing did not happen. That was the strangeness of it. The third thing was a thing he watched her not do. He came in from the yard one evening at the end of February, and the kitchen was empty, and the passage door was open, the one that went through to the old part of the house, the mill office, the room she had told him once in a hard, flat voice, was not used and would not be opened. She was standing in front of it. She had a key in her hand. She was not doing anything at all. She was standing there in the dark with the key against her palm, and she stood there for a long time, and he watched from the passage and did not breathe, and at last she closed her fist round the key and turned away and went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and said, "You are late, the porridge is cold." He said, "What is in that room?" She said, "Nothing that concerns you." He said, "Thomason." It was the first time he had used her name, and it stopped her. She stood with her back to him at the range for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she said, in a voice he had never heard from her, "Do not ask me that again. There is a thing in that room that I could open tomorrow morning, and it would save this house, and I've had the key for 2 years. And every night I do not open it. I am my father's daughter, and every night I am closer to opening it than I was the night before." She said, "That is the whole of what you are getting. Eat your porridge." And Alaric of Kelmarsh, who had walked out of his own life 6 weeks before, with a signed settlement in his coat and no intention of living long enough to honor it, sat down at a stranger's table and ate cold porridge, and understood that he was not, after all, the only person in that kitchen who was standing in the dark with a key in their hand. Bethia Sorrel came up on the Sunday. She was the last servant the Harrows had kept, 71 years old, put out of the house by her own insistence when the money went, and she came up the moor road twice a month to sit and be rude and eat nothing, and count the flour in the crock when Thomason was out of the room. She looked Alaric up and down for a full half-minute in the yard. She said, "You are the vagrant." He said, "I am." She said, "You are not." He said nothing at all. She said, "I have known that girl since she was in leading strings, and I have buried both the people who loved her. And I will tell you the one thing about her that matters, and then you will do as you please, because men do. She has been giving things away her whole life, and nobody has ever given her one single thing back. Not one. Not a loaf, not a word, not a farthing, not a nod on the road. She gives, and the town takes, and the town despises her for the taking, because that is what towns do. And she has decided, because she is her father's daughter, and there is nothing to be done about it, that she will go on giving until there is nothing left of her." She looked at him with 2 very sharp old eyes. She said, "I have watched that happen once already, and I buried him, and I am too old to bury the second one. So whatever you are, and whatever you want, I will say this to you once. She has nothing left to give but the last of herself, and she will give that too, and she will not even notice she is doing it. If you take it, there will be nothing after. Do you understand me?" Alaric said, "I understand you." Bethia Sorrel said, "No, you do not, but you will." And she went in to her tea. They talked at night. It began by accident, the way such things do. She was up late over the accounts, and he came in for water, and she said something to the paper in front of her that she had not meant anybody to hear, and he answered it, and she looked up, and after that it was a habit. He could not tell her the truth about himself. That was the shape of the whole thing, and the strangeness of it, and afterwards, when everything else had been broken and mended, it was the part he was proudest of and most ashamed of at once. He could not tell her his name, or his house, or what he was contracted to do at Marchbury on the 11th of March. Every single fact about him was a lie, and he could not offer her one of them. So he offered her the other things. Instead, he found that if a man may not say anything about himself, he must either say nothing or say the truth. There is no third road. A false name buys you 100 easy conversations. Having no name at all buys you nothing. And so he stopped trying to be pleasant, and began for the first time in his life simply to answer her. She asked him one night whether he had family. He said, "A brother. He is dead. He died owing a great deal of money to a man who has been very patient about it, and the patience has cost me more than the money would have." She asked him whether he had loved his brother. He said no. And then, after a while, "I have thought about that a great deal, and I have decided it is worse than that. I did not love him, and I did not hate him. I did not think about him at all. He was drowning for 2 years in the next room, and I did not once go in because it would have been unpleasant, and I was busy, and there was always going to be time. There was not time. He was 9 and 20, she said, and now you are walking about England in another man's coat. He said, "Yes." She said, "That will not fetch him back." He said, "No, I know that, but I found I could not sit in the room any longer." She let that alone. She did not pry at it, and she did not comfort him, and she did not tell him it was not his fault. And it was the first time in 2 years that a person had heard him say a true thing and had simply let it stand there. And he sat in a mortgaged kitchen on Bellow Moor and felt something come loose in his chest that had been screwed down since the funeral. He said, "May I ask you something?" She said, "You may ask." He said, "Why do you keep the lamp?" And she told him. She told him about a miller who had carried a sack of flour 3 miles for a woman who could not carry it, and who had put a light in a window every night of his life, because Bellow Moor is a bad piece of country to be lost on in the dark. And she told it dryly and without ornament, and she got to the end of it and said, "And everybody in Wexcombe thinks it is the funniest thing they have ever heard of, and I dare say it is." He said, "Does anybody ever come?" She said, "Nobody has ever come. Not once. Not in 26 years." He said, "Then why?" She looked at him across the table with the lamplight on the side of her face, and she said, "Because the whole point of it is that you do not know. That is what it is for. If you only lit it on the nights when somebody was coming, it would not be a light in a window, it would be an appointment." And she got up and took the plates away, and did not see what her words had done to the man sitting opposite her, who had come up out of the dark of that moor in January with his hand rotting and his mind made up, and had turned toward a gate for no reason he could afterwards name except that there had been a light in the window of it. He did not sleep that night. The trouble came into Wexcombe in the first week of March, and it came, as it always does, out of a kindness she could not stop doing. She had gone in for salt. She had the beggar with her, because he could carry, and because the hand was mended enough, and because she had stopped, without once deciding to, thinking of herself as a woman who went into Wexcombe alone. And in the market square in front of 30 people, Alaric of Kelmarsh, 9th Duke of his line, master of 4,000 acres and a house with 60 rooms in it, was shoved off the curb into the wet by a carter who did not like the look of him, and told to take his stink out of a decent town. He did not move. He stood in the road, and something came up into that hard young face that had not been there in 2 months, and 1 or 2 people who were watching took a step backward without knowing why they had. And then Thomas and Harrow got between them. She said, "That man cut 9 ricks of wood for me in January, and asked for nothing." She said it loudly, and the square went quiet, because a quiet street will always turn to look at a woman raising her voice. She said, "That man mended a wall that has been down since my father died, and he did it with a hand that was rotting off him, and when I gave him the last of the food in my house, he would not take the whole of it. He left half of it on the board. He left half of it for me, and he had walked a fortnight to get to my gate, and there is not one man standing in this square who would have done it. She said, and every one of you knows what my father did for you, and every one of you has decided to be a great deal happier calling him a fool than admitting what you owe. And I have let you have that because it costs me nothing, and it seemed to make you comfortable. She said, but you will not shove this man into the road while I am standing in it. Nobody spoke. She said, into the silence, and she was shaking. Come along, we want salt. And she walked the length of the market square at Wexcombe with a beggar at her side, and her back straight, and 30 people watching, and she paid for her salt with a hand that was not steady, and she walked out again, and she did not once look round. She was 300 yards up the moor road before she said, I am sorry, that was not wise. It will make things harder for me, and I did it anyway. I am told I have a temper. It is the only thing my mother left me that they cannot sell. He did not answer her. She glanced across and saw his face, and stopped in the road. She said, what is it? And Alaric of Kelmarsh, who had been spat at, and shoved, and cursed, and gone hungry in a ditch, and had felt nothing about any of it, found he could not for a moment speak, and when he could, what he said was not what he meant to say. He said, no one has ever done that for me. She said, then you have kept poor company. He said, yes, I have. I have kept the best company in England. The notice was nailed to her gate on the 9th of March. It was done in the night, which was the coward's way of it, and she found it in the morning, and she stood in the cold, and read it 3 times before it went in. The sale of the freehold house and land known as Harrow, on the moor road at Wexcombe, by order of the mortgagee, at the Assembly Rooms, Wexcombe on the 25th day of March, being Lady Day, and at the foot of it, in the small print that nobody reads, the name of the mortgagee, the Right Honourable the Earl of Crawl. She did not know the name. There was no reason on earth she should have known it. She stood in her own gateway, with a piece of paper in her hand, and she thought, so it is a man in London, and I have never met him, and he has never seen this house, and he will never see it, and on Lady Day he will take it, and it will cost him no more thought than crossing out a line. Behind her, on the path, the man she called nothing at all, because he had never given her anything to call him, had gone perfectly still. She did not see it. She went in and put the paper on the table and looked at it, and then she got up and went to the passage, and she took the key off the nail, and she opened the door of her father's office for the first time in 2 years. He followed her. He should not have. He did. It was a small, cold room, with a desk in it, and the smell of paper gone damp, and she lit a candle and set it down and stood looking at the ledger on the desk without touching it. And after a while she said without turning round, do you know what this is? Said no. She said, it is what everybody in Wexcombe owes my father. She opened it. She turned the pages slowly. He came and stood at her shoulder and looked down at a fair, round hand, 26 years of it, column after column, and every few pages there was a line drawn through a name and a figure, and beside the line, in the same fair hand, no comment at all. She said Corrigan, £9, Ludlow, £11 4, Merrick, 2 years of flour. She never paid a farthing of it, and she crosses the lane for me now. Pankhurst, £6, Vosper, 14, Chegwidden, 4.5. She turned to the last page and put her finger on the bottom of it. She said, £419, 11 shillings. She said, the mortgage is 380. She stood there with her finger on the figure. She said, I could have that money, not all of it. Some of them are dead, and some of them have nothing, but there is enough. There is enough alive and solvent in that book to save this house, and the law is on my side, and I have known it for 2 years, and every single night I have not done it. He said, why not? And she turned round and looked at him, and he saw that she was crying, which he had not once seen, and which she was doing in a completely silent and businesslike way, as though it were an inconvenience happening to somebody else. She said, because he struck them out. She said he struck them out with his own hand and he never told a soul. And if I go into that town and put that book on a table and take 400 pounds out of the people he forgave, then he was a fool. Do you understand me? Why, then every word they have ever said about him in that tavern is true, and it was never a gift at all. It was a loan with a long fuse on it, and I will have proved them right, and he will have been a fool, and I will not do it. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, angrily. She said, "So I shall lose the house instead. That is the sum. That is the whole of my situation. And I have looked at it every night for 2 years, and it does not come out any other way." And then she said, and this was the thing that finished him, "I am not brave. Please do not think I am brave. I am so tired that I can hardly stand up, and there is a part of me that wants to open that book so badly that I have had to keep the door locked, and I am going to lose my father's house on the 25th of this month because of 419 pounds that I am too proud to take from people who hate me." She said, "That is not courage. That is only a woman who cannot bear to be the second hero to be laughed at." He said her name. He said it in a voice she had never heard, and she looked up, and the man standing in her father's office was not the man who had been splitting her wood since January. He was standing quite straight. His hands were at his sides, and his face had gone through some change that she could not have described and never afterwards forgot, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at the last thing he is ever going to see. He said, "I am going to tell you the truth now, and when I have told you, you will put me out of this house, and you will be right too, and I will go." She said, "What?" He said, "My name is Alaric Vane. I am the 9th Duke of Kelmarsh. I have 4,000 acres in Northamptonshire, and a house that would swallow this one and never notice, and I have not done an honest hour's work in my life until I came into your yard." The room was very quiet. He said, "On the 11th day of this month, which is 2 days from now, I am contracted to marry Lady Sydney Craw at Marchbury. The settlement is signed. It was signed in November. It cannot be broken by me without the forfeit of every unentailed thing I own," he said. "And Lady Sydney Craw is the daughter of the Earl of Craw." He watched her understand it. He watched it arrive. He said, "The man whose name is on the notice nailed to your gate is my father-in-law in 2 days. She did not move. He said, "And I knew. I have known since the first night. I came into Wexcombe with a list of the properties that come to the Craw interest by that marriage, and this house was on it. And I came up this road in rags, and I lay down at your gate, and you came out and gave me your Sunday bacon and lied to me about having eaten it." He said, "And I have sat at your table for 2 months, knowing that the family I am marrying into means to put you out of it on Lady Day. And I did not tell you, because every day I did not tell you was another day I got to sit there." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. It went on a very long time. Then Thomason Harrow said, in a voice with nothing whatever in it, "Get out of my father's house." He went. That was the thing she had not expected and could not forgive him for afterwards, and did forgive him for later still. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not put a hand out. He looked at her for a moment as if he were memorizing something, and then he walked out of the office and through the kitchen and out of the door, and she heard the gate, and she stood in the cold little room with a candle and a ledger, and 419 pounds she would never take, and that was that. Ruddock had a horse at the inn at Wexcombe within the hour, and Alaric took it. He rode to Marchbury through the night, and he arrived at 8 in the morning, caked to the thigh in the mud of Bellow Moor, and he was taken up the great stairs of another man's house in another man's coat, and he stood in front of the Earl of Craw in the long library, and he said what he had come to say. He said, "I will not do it. Krall was a pleasant man. That was the worst of him. He was 60 and easy, and he had a way of looking mildly amused by everything, including himself, which had disarmed better men than Alaric for 40 years. He heard him out to the end, and he did not interrupt, and when it was done he poured 2 glasses of a wine that had been laid down before either of them was born. He said, "Sit down, Kelmarsh. You look like a ditch," he said. "Now, let us be very calm and very clear, because you are going to say some things in the next 10 minutes that you cannot take back, and I would like you to say them knowing exactly what they cost." He set the paper on the table between them. He said, "Your brother borrowed £42,000 from me over 4 years. He did it in secret, and he did it badly, and he ran to Boulogne rather than tell you, and he died there in a rented room with the bailiffs on the stairs, and I have always thought that the running was the one decisive thing he ever did. I have never called that debt in. I have been the soul of patience. I have said nothing to any living creature, and there is not a man in London who knows how Lord Osric Vane died, and the name of Kelmarsh stands where it has stood for 400 years. He said, and it stands there because I hold this paper, and because in November you signed another one, and the 2 of them go together like a lock and a key." He drank his wine. He said, "Marry my daughter on the 11th, and the 42,000 goes into the fire, and your brother stays what the world thinks he was, which was a charming young man who died of a fever abroad." He said, "Do not marry my daughter, and I shall be obliged to be less patient, and then there will be a public sale, and there will be an inquest reopened, and there will be a great many letters read out in a great many rooms, and the name of Kelmarsh will be, within about 6 weeks, a thing that footmen laugh at." He said, "And I do not say this unkindly, but you will not save the miller's daughter by ruining yourself. You will merely be a ruined man standing next to her while I take her house anyway, because I shall take it either way. The house is worth £900. It is a detail. It has never once been the point." He smiled. He said, "The point is that I have spent 30 years buying up small debts in small towns from men too proud to notice they were being bought, and it has made me the largest landlord in 3 counties, and no one has ever once said a word about it, and I intend to keep it that way. And you, my dear boy, are the price of that silence, and you always have been," Alaric said, and Sidonie Krall waved a hand. "Sidonie will do as she is told," and a voice from the window said, "No, Papa, Sidonie will not." She had been sitting in the deep window seat with a book the whole while, and neither of them had seen her, and she got up now and came down the long room, and Alaric had met her 4 times and had never once looked at her, and he looked at her now. She was 26. She had a plain, clever, wretchedly unhappy face. She said, "I have listened to you buy him twice, and I did not say anything the first time, and I have been ashamed of it for 4 months. She said to Alaric, "You have never wanted me, and I have never wanted you, and I have known since November that you did not so much as remember the color of my eyes, and I let it go on because I have never in my life been able to make my father hear the word no." She turned to Krall and her voice shook, and she said it anyway. She said, "I am saying it now. No, I will not have him. I release him. Do what you like to me." Krall looked at his daughter for a long moment with the pleasant amusement quite gone out of his face, and what was underneath it was not pleasant at all. He said very softly, "Then I shall be obliged to ruin him, my dear, and you will have done it." And Alaric Vane, standing in a stranger's library in a dead miller's coat with his brother's grave and his family's name and 400 years of it all in one man's fist, heard himself laugh. He said, "My lord, I have spent 39 years being careful, and it has cost me a brother, and I have been 2 months in a house where a woman sold her mother's ring to buy oil for a lamp that nobody has ever come to." He said, "Do it. Read the letters. Open the inquest. Tell them all he was a bankrupt and tell them how he ended. And tell them what I did not do, which is the only part of it I am actually ashamed of. He said, I would rather be laughed at in every drawing room in England for the rest of my life than be the man who took her house. He picked up the settlement off the table. He said, the sale is on the 25th. I will see you at Wexcombe. And he tore it in half, and he put the halves in his pocket because he had one thing left to do with them, and he walked out. They filled the assembly rooms at Wexcombe on Lady Day, and they did not come to bid. There were 4 men there who had come to bid, and 300 who had come to watch, and Thomas and Harrow knew exactly what they had come to watch, because she had grown up among them, and there is no entertainment in a small, hard town like the fall of a proud house. She came in on Matthias Sorrel's arm at noon. She had put on the grey wool, mended with the strip cut out of the hem, and the hem taken up to hide it. She sat in the 3rd row where the auctioneer had put a chair for her, and she looked straight ahead, and the room made a space around her the way a room will, and she sat in the middle of it alone with 300 people, and she did not cry, and she did not look at anybody, and she waited for it to be over. Corrigan was there, the Ludlows were there. The widow Merrick was in the back row, and she had brought a friend. The Earl of Crawle was on the platform beside the auctioneer, being pleasant. At 6 minutes past noon, the doors at the back of the assembly rooms opened. They did not all turn at once. It went through the room the way it goes, one row and then another, a turning and a rustle and then a silence that came down the hall like a hand pressing on it, and Thomas and Harrow did not turn, because she was looking straight ahead and had decided to go on, looking straight ahead, and then she saw the auctioneer's face. He was standing in the doorway. He was in black, and it was very plain, and there was nothing about it that shouted, and it did not need to, because a coat like that had not been seen in the assembly rooms at Wexcombe in living memory, and every soul in the room knew what it was, in about a second and a half. There was a man behind him with a box. He came down the center of the room. He did not hurry. The people got out of the way of him without being asked, and 1 or 2 of them, the ones who had been in the market square 3 weeks before, went the color of paper. He walked past the platform without looking at Crawle at all. He came to the 3rd row, and he came into the empty space that 300 people had made around Thomas and Harrow, and he stood in it beside her chair, so that the space was not empty anymore, and so that from that moment on, anybody in that room who wished to shun the miller's daughter would have to shun a duke to do it. Then he turned and faced them. He said, "My name is Alaric Vane. I am the Duke of Kelmarsh. 3 weeks ago I was shoved off the curb of your market square into the wet, and told to take my stink out of a decent town, and I want to begin by saying that I bear no grudge whatever for it, because it was the most useful afternoon of my life." Nobody laughed. Nobody breathed. He said, "I came to Wexcombe in rags, because I was to be married into a family that was about to take this woman's house, and I laid down in her gateway on a January night because I was ill and finished, and had gone as far as I could go, and she came out of that house, and gave me the food out of her own mouth, and lied to me about it. And she did not know my name, and she has never asked it, and there was nothing on this earth that she could possibly have got out of me," he said, "though I stayed, and I watched, and I am going to tell you now what I saw, because you have all lived beside it for 2 years, and you have arranged very carefully not to see it, and I am afraid that arrangement is over." He took the ledger out of the box. "He," said Ephraim Corrigan, £9 struck out in the winter of the fever, when your wife was ill and you could not pay. It is in his hand. I have it here." Corrigan did not move. He said the Ludlow family, £11 4s. Mrs. Merrick of Kite's Bottom, 2 years of flour and never a farthing, asked Vosper, £14. Pankhurst, 6. Chegwodden, £4 10. He turned the page. He said, £419, 11s, forgiven in 1 winter, by a man who then borrowed against his own mill to go on feeding you, and lost the mill, and borrowed against his house, and lost that too, and died of a lung fever he took, carrying coals to a house that was not his own. He said, and you called him a fool. He said, and I have heard it said, I have heard it over your own gates and across your own counters, by men who were fed out of his loft. And I understood it, because I am not a good man, and I know exactly why you did it. You said it because gratitude is heavy and contempt is light, and you were carrying him and you wanted to put him down. He said, and his daughter has known that for 2 years, and has had this book in a locked room the whole of that time, and could have taken every penny of it out of you in a court of law at any hour she chose, and has not. He said, she is losing that house today rather than open this book, because if she opened it, her father would have been a fool, and she would rather be homeless than let you make him one. The silence in the assembly rooms at Wexcombe on Lady Day was a thing that the people who were in that room described to their grandchildren. He set the ledger down. He said, now, to the Earl of Crawle. He turned at last and looked at him. He said, my lord, you have spent 30 years buying up the small debts of small towns from men too proud to look up, and you have made yourself the largest landlord in 3 counties out of it, and you told me so yourself in your own library on the 10th of this month, and your daughter was sitting in the window and heard every word of it. He took the halves of the settlement out of his coat and dropped them on the floor. B said, my brother died, owing you £42,000, and you have kept it quiet for 2 years. And you were going to keep it quiet for the rest of my life, and the price was to be this. So let me save you the trouble, he said, and his voice never rose at all. My brother, Lord Osric Vane, died a bankrupt in a rented room in Boulogne, with nobody in the world beside him, and it need not have happened. He was 29. He was drowning for 2 years in the next room, and I did not go in, because it was unpleasant and I was busy. There it is said, in front of 300 people, in the town where it is worth the least and costs me the most. He said, it is not worth anything to you now, my lord. It has stopped being a secret, and a man like you has nothing else. Crawle stood on the platform in front of a room that was very slowly beginning to turn and look at him, and he opened his mouth and there was nothing in it. He got down off the platform and he went up the middle of the room and out, and the people did not get out of his way, and he had to go round them one by one the whole length of the hall. Alaric Vane turned back to the room. He said, the sale is cancelled. The mortgage on that house stood at £380. I have redeemed it this morning, in full, in coin, before witnesses. And there is not a court in England that permits a mortgagee to refuse the money when it is put into his hand. He said, the house is hers. It always was. And then he sat down in the empty chair beside Thomas and Harrow, in the 3rd row, in front of everybody, and he did not say another word. It was a fortnight before she would speak to him properly, and he did not press her, and afterwards she said that if he had pressed her by so much as 1 day, she would have refused him. He took a room at the inn at Wexcombe, which the innkeeper's wife cleaned 4 times in one afternoon, and then wept about. He did not come up the moor road. He sent nothing and asked for nothing. On the 15th day, she walked into Wexcombe and stood in the doorway of the inn parlor and said, come and split my wood. You are the only one who knows where I keep the axe. He came. They did not talk about it that day, or the next. They talked about it on the 3rd evening, in the kitchen, at the table in the same 2 chairs. She said, I want to know why you really came. He said, I have told you why. The house was on a list. She said, no. That is what you told the assembly rooms, and it is true, and it is not the reason, and I have been thinking about it for a fortnight, and I am not stupid, and I want to know what a man is doing walking a fortnight in the open in January with a hand rotting off him going nowhere, when he has 60 rooms and a carriage and could look at a list from an armchair. He was quiet for a long time. He said, I was not going to Marchbury. She waited. He said, I signed the settlement in November, and I went home and I sat in my brother's room. which I had not gone into since they brought him back, and I sat there for 11 hours. And in the morning I put on a coat out of the servants' hall, and I walked out of the house, and I did not take a horse, and I did not tell anybody but Ruddick, and I told him I was going to look at the Crawl properties because a man must say something. He said I was not going to look at anything. I walked out onto that moor in January with no money and no food, and a hand I had cut on a gate and let go bad on purpose, and I walked until I could not walk, and then I lay down out of the wind at the turn of a wall. He said, I did not lie down there to be found, Thomason. I lay down there to stop. She did not say anything at all. He said, and I would have. It was 2 degrees of frost, and I was long past the point where a man argues with himself. I put my head down on a stone in the angle of your gate, and I was perfectly content, and it was the first time I had been content in 2 years. He said, and I opened my eyes. He said, and there was a light. He said it was straight in front of me, over the wall, in a window. And I lay in the mud looking at it, and I thought, there is somebody sitting up. And I lay there a long time thinking about that, because a lamp in a window at that hour, out on a road like that, means somebody is expecting somebody. And it means that somebody in that house is waiting for a person to come in out of the dark. He said, and I remember thinking, with a very great deal of bitterness, that I would have liked to be that person once, and that no one had ever left a light on for me in my life. His voice was not steady. He said, and I got up. He said, that is the whole truth, and I have never told it to anybody. I did not get up because I chose to live. I got up because there was a light on, and I wanted to see who it was for. That is all. That is the entire reason I am sitting in this kitchen. He said, and I came round the wall and up to the gate to look at it, and I had no strength left, and I went down against the stone, and I was lying there when you came home. She had her hand over her mouth. He said, it was not for anybody. You told me so yourself. Nobody has ever come. 26 years, and nobody has ever once come up that road in the dark and seen that lamp. He said, I came. He said, I was the one. After 26 years, on the 11th of January, I was the man your father lit it for, and neither of you ever knew, and he had been dead 2 years. And Thomason Harrow put her head down on her father's kitchen table and wept for the first time since the funeral, and Alaric Vane did not touch her, and did not speak, and let her. He asked her in April. He did it properly, and he did it late, and he did it in a way she understood only afterwards, when Bethiah Sorrell explained it to her with enormous satisfaction. He put the freehold of the house on the Moor Road into her name absolutely, with no charge on it and no condition and no lien, and he did it through Mr. Ottery, and he did not tell her he was doing it. He settled $600 a year on her out of the Kelmarsh estate as a debt owed by his family to hers, and he wrote it in such a way that it could not be revoked by him, by her, by marriage, or by any court in England. She read the papers in Mr. Ottery's front office with her boots leaking, and she said, What is this? Mr. Ottery said that Miss Harrow is a woman who does not need anybody, and he was smiling, and he was not a man who smiled. Alaric came up the Moor Road that evening. He said, You have the house. You have your father's name back in this town, and you may go anywhere in England you like and never see me again, and you will be perfectly comfortable, and it is all done, and it cannot be undone. He said, I did that first, on purpose, because I have watched a man buy a wife with a debt, and I would rather be dead than do it. He said, so now there is nothing between us and no reason on earth for you to say yes. He said, and I am asking you to marry me. He said, I am not a good man. I was a careless one, and it killed my brother. I have been 39 years in the best company in England, and not one of them ever put a light in a window, and I did not know that I minded until I was lying face down in your gateway looking at yours. He said, Marry me, Thomason. There are 60 rooms in that house, and I have never once been able to sit in any of them. And Thomason Harrow who had £419 in a ledger she would never open, and a house she owned outright, and £600 a year, and no need of him whatever, which was exactly the point and had cost him a great deal to arrange, stood in her own doorway on the moor road and looked at him. She said, "I have something to say. First, and you will let me say it." She said, "You stood up in the assembly rooms in front of 300 people, and you gave me back my father, and I will be grateful to you for that until the day I die." She said, "But that is not why." She said, "It was the bacon." She said it was a Thursday, and it was Sunday's bacon, and there was no more, and I gave it to a filthy stranger in a rotten coat who could do nothing for me, and never would. And you looked at the empty board in front of me, and you asked me whether I had eaten." She said, "Nobody in this world has asked me that. Not once, not the whole time." She said, "And you had nothing then. You were nothing. You were a beggar in my kitchen with a hand going black, and you had no name and no coat and no title and nothing whatever to give me, and you looked up and asked whether I had eaten." She said, "That is the man I am marrying. Not the one in the black coat, the one in the mud." She said, "Yes." They were married at Wexcombe in the summer, in the church, and the church was full, and half the people in it had crossed the lane from her once, and knew that she knew it, and she was pleasant to every one of them, which Bethiah Sorrell said was the most terrible revenge she had ever seen taken in her life. Corrigan the smith came out to the moor road in May with £9 in a bag, and could not look at her. She would not take it. She took his hand instead, in the road in front of his son, and told him that it had been struck out by a better man than either of them, and it was going to stay struck out, and he cried, and she pretended not to see it, and afterwards she said to her husband that she had never known there was so much pleasure to be had in the world. They lived at Kelmarsh in the 60 rooms, and she filled a great many of them, and Bethiah Sorrell came and died there, at 83, in a bed with a fire in it, insufferable to the last. But the house on the moor road was never sold, and it was never let, and it was never shut up. A man was paid to live in it. That was all he was paid to do. He kept the roof sound, and the gate mended, and the yard swept, and he had one other duty, which was written into his terms, and which was the only one that mattered. Every night of the year, at dusk, in that empty house, on that empty road 4 miles from anywhere, he lit a brass lamp in the front window, and he trimmed it, and he let it burn until morning. Nobody ever came. In 60 years, nobody ever came. The Duke and Duchess of Kelmarsh drove out to Bellow Moor every January, on the 11th, and stood in the road below the gate, and looked up at it, and did not usually say anything, because there was not very much to say. Once, near the end, a young man of the family who did not know the story, and had been brought along to make up the carriage, asked why they kept it, when nobody in the world would ever see it, and the old Duke, who by then said very little, looked up at the window for a while. And he said, "Because the whole point of it is that you do not know." He said, "I was lying in that gateway, and it was the coldest night of my life, and I had walked a fortnight and gone as far as a man goes, and I had made up my mind, and a light came on that was not for anybody." He said, "And it was for me."